Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Ari Theriger and today I'm going to share with you some interesting findings, at least I find it interesting, that may report to the pre-Christian origins of the visual representation of the Ægishjálmur. And please do take special attention to what is being told, the visual origins of the symbol, not the symbol itself, neither its meaning, but instead pre-Christian symbols that may have been the original designs, iconographic representations that throughout the course of time progressively developed and may be visually the symbols that would help to construct the design of the Ægishjálmur, which is a post-Christian modern Icelandic magic symbol, right? Well, this video today, unlike my other videos, is in great part actually the research work of Professor Johnni Langer, who focuses on the study and the dissemination of the history and culture of medieval Scandinavia, especially the Viking Age, from the Federal University of Paraíba, Brazil, from whom I have learned a great deal in these past 2 years or so, especially in our conversations and exchange of information. His work is mainly in Portuguese, from Brazil, of course, so I'll leave a link to his video presentation down below in the description of this video, and I think the audience that speaks Portuguese will be happy to accompany such a wonderful work. With his permission, of course, I'm here to share with you this research still under development, sharing it in the English language as best as possible so that such information can be spread and exchanged to and with a broader audience. I'll be adding other type of information as well, other symbols too, and content from my own research work as well. So let's get into it, my dear friends. Please. As has been said here previously, videos I've made before about the Ægishjálmur itself and other Galdrastafir, Icelandic magic staves, the current form of the Ægishjálmur, the most famous and widespread and most tattooed symbol, appears in the 17th century paper manuscript LBS 1438VO, known as the Galdrastafir, Booklet of Spells, kept in the National Library of Iceland. However, we have an iconographic representation that seems to have given rise to this symbol, which in the 17th century took on a more complex form. Now, in the oldest manuscript containing a proto-Galdrastafir and in turn also a cruciform, it is the small manuscript known as Ægishjálmur. It's from the early 15th century, 16th century, the 1500s, sorry, and is kept in Copenhagen. This is the oldest known Galdrastafir, Icelandic magic stave, and it dates from the early 16th century, as I said. The symbol indicated here is it is presented as a solution to discover the identity of a thief. As previously mentioned, these symbols developed and have become more complex in their visual form, reaching the visual representation of the Ægishjálmur as we know it in a more elaborate way, appearing only in the 17th century, but having already had iconographic developments since the 16th century in Iceland. As has also been said in other videos, Icelandic magic staves have had a visual and knowledge development from a fusion of esoteric, magical and using sacred geometry in a historical point roughly from the 12th to the 14th centuries in continental Europe, the culmination of the European character of this magical knowledge, a well of continental esotericism bringing together the magical and esoteric arts of both East and West. Going back in time to the 1400s, in Greece, we have the famous manuscript Arle 5596, which contains one of the oldest surviving records of King Solomon's clavicle. We can clearly notice several symbols that will also be found in Iceland a century later, among them a clear iconography that is identical not only to several Galdrastafir but also to the Ægishjálmur itself. These symbols of a Judeo-Christian origin will spread throughout Europe eventually influencing the creation of several magical symbols, sigils, which entered the popular religious magical culture of several countries, such as England, for example, and also eventually in Iceland, giving rise to the Galdrastafir, Icelandic magic staves. However, we can go back in time further still, looking for a similar iconography, which may be the visual origins of these symbols. That's what we are going to talk about now, and that's the focus of this video. Therefore, in conclusion, the Ægishjálmur is a magical symbol found in Icelandic manuscripts, grimoires, during the late Renaissance and mostly in the 17th century, with some variations in its morphology, even in the 19th century, as is the case of another well-known and more elaborate symbol, the Vegvísir. But let's then look at possible visual origins, not origins in meaning, but rather focusing on the morphology of certain symbols whose appearance may have influenced the formation of visual symbology from which the Ægishjálmur may have its origins in terms of visual iconography. Bearing in mind that the oldest images of the Ægishjálmur are in the form of a cross, this already gives us some indications if we look for cruciforms, of course. A cross with 4 triplicate terminals, and I know that many of you immediately think of the Ægishjálmur rune, although that is not the origin, not least because this rune, before being a representative symbol of an idea linked to a letter and the formation of a written form, is an extremely ancient symbol that can be found almost all over the world, especially in the Neolithic. Just the other day, I was precisely doing some work, this time not excavating, thank the gods, but in reference to a megalithic monument in Portugal, dating from the Neolithic, one of hundreds of examples of engravings on stone that present these symbols, and they are symbols that certainly influenced the creation of several other symbols for millennia. We don't need to go so far back and look to turn this into such a complexity of symbologies. Bearing in mind that we are dealing with Nordic context, it has been suggested before, of course, by some authors, mostly with works that are more esoteric than academic, that the origins of the Ægishjálmur may have its origins in rock art from the Scandinavian Bronze Age, mostly in the petroglyphs found in the area of Sweden, more precisely in the area of Tanum. More specifically, a globe with joints, with terminals that resemble the Ægishjálmur. Here we are then in the Bronze Age, a pre-Christian depiction and the human interaction with this object. But we have a problem here, as we have the representation of 2 people, 2 women, actually interacting or carrying this large globe. But what we see here is not a symbol per se, but rather the iconographic representation of something which we do not know what it could possibly be. We are not sure what it is. This is not a symbology, nor was it created as a symbology, but the representation of something more concrete. Like the representation of animals and people that we have here. They are not symbols, but clear representations of something rather than being a symbology that refers to an idea. In other words, we are dealing with figurations and not symbologies. In the Scandinavian Bronze Age, what is really considered a geometric symbol with a religious character is the wheel of the sun, or the sun wheel, which we will speak of shortly. This globe, however, has already been considered by some scholars to be the symbolic representation of the sun. However, I completely disagree. I disagree in part. This type of structure is common on Bronze Age objects found in different parts of the world, actually. In this particular context we are dealing with here today, it is found on Nordic rock carvings. I do not agree to be a sun symbol. It's not a symbol at all, and the idea alone of being the representation of the sun is contradicted by the fact that the well-known and more common sun symbol, which is a circle with a cross, appears on the same rock carvings, and it clearly indicates a geometric symbol with a religious character, the symbol for the sun. This globe, however, we do not know its meaning. A possible interpretation is that these are representations of hands or of people somewhat linked to a globe, a possible unification of peoples, the world of humans looked after by two goddesses, or that indeed those little arms could be representations of flames, as there are similar representations of such on other contexts. And it may be the gathering around the fire or the representation of a comet, but this is all speculation, mind you. On the very same context, the sun wheel is represented, indicating an actual representation of the sun apart from other representations of other modes of life and important elements in these people's lives as a practical tool to maintain their religious needs and balance within society. The ring cross or the sun wheel was a common symbol in the Nordic area and can still be seen on ancient slabs and in many churches as well. It was also common in pre-Columbian America and throughout a large part of the Mediterranean region about 3,500 years ago. Therefore, whatever the representation of this globe with arms is or might have been, it would not be the sun, right? Because the representation of the sun is in the same context. In fact, a ship transports a big wheel cross. It transports the sun in what it seems to me at least to be a mythological representation. The solar wheel was the most important and widespread religious symbol of the Scandinavian Bronze Age, and this is indeed a geometric symbol, so there is no evidence in this period of a symbol with the characteristics that we are really looking for that could have influenced the visual representation of the Ægishjálmur. I take the opportunity to recall that eventually, from about the 4th century of the Common Era onwards, the swastika entered Scandinavia under Roman influence, a solar symbol that will replace the solar wheel. And we have a very interesting example actually, which is the runic stone of Snøhvit, that contained a solar wheel, and on top, in a later period of course, a swastika is engraved on top of it, thus continuing the solar meaning in a religious context but applying a new symbol. This is important to mention to better understand other cases that we will see further ahead, don't worry. Our next candidate is quite majestic, with very interesting features and a slender, slightly curvy body. The golden horn of Gallehus. Two horn-shaped objects actually made of gold, discovered in the area of Denmark. The smaller horn has runic inscriptions, and in one of the depicted scenes there seems to be a symbol that could then be a good candidate to the visual formation of the Ægishjálmur. Let's say a proto-Ægishjálmur. We are dealing with an object from the period of migration, dating from the 5th century of the Common Era, which is technically a period more closely linked culturally to what will become the so-called Viking period, which is the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age, which is the culmination of various cultures, concepts and artistic styles of the Iron Age. So the iconographies and symbols of this period are more connected with each other than with the art, iconography and symbology of the Bronze Age. The problem here is that this figure, this proto-Ægishjálmur, is not a symbology in itself, as it is embedded in representations of star configurations. This is undoubtedly a very complex object that requires special attention, only focused on it in another video. However, all the studies around this artifact and its iconography, according to most researchers, of course, this configuration is inserted in an stellar scenic set. That is, all these images next to warriors are representations of stars and not a symbol, being precisely the same problem that we saw earlier in relation to the rock art of the Bronze Age. We are thus faced again with figurations, in this case with a stellar panorama. The symbols of this period and throughout the Scandinavian Iron Age are well known and consistent, and we do not see such symbols here in this object, in this particular object. Were this a symbol of this period, we would then see it more often in other representations, which isn't the case at all. The idea here seems to indicate a figuration, as I said, an iconographic representation of a star. We have a much better candidate, which may be at the visual origins of what would eventually become the crosses of the first Icelandic grimoires that would then develop into the Ægishjálmur. Solar crosses in the region of Poland engraved on funerary pottery from the Przeworsk culture. This is a very interesting culture that is the culmination of a great ethnic mixture of Proto-Slavs, Germanic and Celts, which will give rise to very detailed and defined symbologies, quite varied. In this specific case, we have a funerary pottery, a funerary urn that has a symbol very similar to what will later be known as the Ægishjálmur, perhaps. However, here we don't have a specific name for this symbol on this funerary urn, so we will call it solar cross, and I'll explain why. However, I must say that the most widespread idea about this symbol is that it represents the crossed hands of hunters. Currently, the cross is known as the hands of God, although such a name does not appear in any source, but is thus named especially by the neo-pagan Slavic community, who usually links this symbol to the god Svarog, and therefore a symbol adopted by many communities of Slavic neo-paganism, so something quite modern. But as I was saying, due to the lack of a concrete name, and in fact due to the lack of evidences to indicate that they are stylized representations of hands, we will call it a solar cross, as this symbol is related to the swastika in this same pottery. As you can see, we have two scenes here actually, one in which this symbol is related to 4 swastika crosses, and one on each branch of its arms, and another in which it is next to a swastika. Hence, it is preferable to call this symbol solar cross, as it is related here with another very widespread symbol, which is the symbolic representation of the sun and linked to a solar religious character. The swastika is the solar symbol in greater number practically throughout all of Eurasia. It is the most important religious symbol of ancient Eurasia, so I would say that it is not a good idea to discard the swastika in the study of this symbology that we see here somewhere, as it is clearly linked to a solar cult, which allows us to have a little more concrete ideas about this symbol, or this symbology. The swastika is a symbol mostly related to solar connotations, so if this cross-shaped symbol is related to the swastika, it obviously has a solar connotation. As it is a funerary object, it is related to life, to light, therefore a set of ideas connected to all these solar elements of the afterlife. Therefore an idea of rebirth, of surviving death on another realm of life. Obviously, the swastika is a very complex symbol with many variations in meanings and also in morphology. And over a few millennia, it became widespread, being inserted in various contexts that almost always go back to solar conceptions or ideas of rebirth, ascendancy, rising to light, and survival of life linked to solar characteristics and renewal of light and life itself. So, taking into account the culture, period, and object, I would say that this symbology is therefore connected to issues of rebirth and afterlife, the swastika being a life-generating symbol. So this solar cross, as it is connected to the swastika, would have then also a similar connotation. Therefore, we are facing a symbology that is more similar to the representation of the oldest known Ægishjálmur in an Icelandic context of the 16th century. In a Scandinavian context, we know that the swastika is then inserted in the period of migrations, as we saw before. It came to replace the sun wheel of the Bronze Age, and possibly then this solar cross that we see here also spread further to the west and northwest during the same period. Of course, I know the swastika is an older symbol, but it took its time to reach other parts and cultures of ancient Eurasia. It is one of the oldest symbols of the Asian area, and Asia is the place where the swastika was created, or at least where there is the oldest and largest evidences of it. A symbol that appears approximately 2000 years before the Common Era. Therefore, a very old symbol, but its diffusion in Europe was during the period of migrations. Celtic, Germanic, and Roman groups helped to spread this symbol across Europe, mostly in the Iron Age, with greater diffusion during the migration period, in the Germanic context at least. And then the swastika ends up entering Scandinavia during the 4th century of the Common Era. It is therefore a valid hypothesis that the solar cross that we saw earlier on the funerary urn was also widespread in the same period of migrations across Europe, including Scandinavia. And we really have a comparative context in the Irish context, medieval period, between the 5th century and the 8th century. There it is, between these centuries after the period of migrations in the European continental area. This symbol would then enter Ireland at last. So we have a symbol similar to what we saw earlier in Eastern Europe, and in turn quite similar to what would become the proto-Ægishjálmur of the 16th century Iceland. In the Irish example, we are, of course, within a Christian religious context, a variation of the Christian cross, which is morphologically quite similar to the Ægishjálmur, as you can see. We are facing an ecclesiastical context of the medieval Irish period, in which these crosses, which are tripled in their terminals, may have been influenced by Merovingian Gaul. So not only did these forms of crosses and the swastika itself enter the medieval Irish area, they also entered the Merovingian Gaul Germanic area in the period, which at the beginning of the period of migrations, through relations and cultural influences, helped these symbols to be propagated, resignified by Christianity, of course, as a cross of Christ, a cross within the Christian culture in the area of Ireland. Therefore, a similar morphology, but of course, the meanings are different within both the religious and magical religious context. The symbol is adapted within the symbolism of Christian culture, and in another case, still within the medieval Irish context, we then have an evolution of the morphology of the same symbol. So we have the same symbol, but having the representation of the Jewish candlestick or chandelier, right, in one of its ramifications. Here we see the fusion of a Christian cross, or rather, of the pre-Christian solar symbol that was resignified as a Christian cross, merging with a Jewish symbology, a representation of a Jewish symbolism. This is important to bear in mind, as Ireland will have several important connections with Scandinavia, and certainly there was this spread of religious symbolism. Now, the Pièce de résistance, un artefact si intéressant que je commençais même à parler français sans raison. We then come to an important object discovered in the area of Scandinavia, dating from the Viking Age. A pottery from Hedeby, dating from the 8th century of the Common Era, found in an area back then, at this period, southern Denmark, currently northern Germany. A funerary ceramic with a spectacular iconography. Then we have a scene of deer, running deer, and at the top a symbol that is very similar to the solar crosses that we saw earlier, both in Eastern Europe and Ireland. We are facing evidences within the pre-Christian pagan context. We can then see a scene with deer, 3 representations of swastikas as well. Let's focus a little on the context of the 5 deer below the swastikas. For a better understanding of this religious scene we have here. I find these type of representations fascinating. They show fantastic dynamism, clearly the ability to represent movement through stylized figures. So we have that solar cross alone up there, isolated from the rest of the scene, represented below. So it is very likely the representation of the sun or a solar sense with characteristics of rebirth, of light after darkness, post-survival of death. I say this because we then have the repetition of the swastika 3 times, also a character of light associated with the animals represented here. Here it seems that it is a representation of sunlight and not the sun itself, sunlight falling on the deer, the swastikas on the deer, right? Deer, in turn, is a very important iconography since the Bronze Age, but I think that we should look here at 2 important cultural factors to try to better understand the representation of deer. Looking at this type of iconography in a broader panorama, and look at the iconography of deer in a geographical and temporal context. Here we have a ceramic that portrays a set of iconographies and symbolisms that are a combination of cultures and concepts. Deer are normally associated with life, connotations that transports us to the cycle of life and death and rebirth, and also related to fertility, which in a way both sunlight and the cycle of rebirth in nature are already linked to connotations of fertility, of the survival of the species. If we look at the prehistoric context of Western Europe, we see precisely important rock art that reports to this religious dynamism in relation to an animist perspective. For example, Paleolithic rock art found in the Coa Valley, Val do Coa, Portugal, where we see representations of cervine, deer, stags, reindeer as well, represented with lifelines inside the body, linking important animal parts such as the mouth, heart, and genitalia. A representation of the animal's spirit, life, its breath, the breath of life, the spirit itself, the heart that keeps it alive, and in part the physical essence of the animal, and its genitalia that generates life and the continuation of life. Usually they are representations of the dominant male or dominant males, several of them, that were not hunted, as it was important to keep these animals alive as they were responsible for the continuation of the reproduction within the herd, hence entering a prehistoric religious context as animals of great importance in the life cycle and in the continuation of life. These representations will appear later in the Epipaleolithic, Mesolithic, Scandinavia, Western Norway. So we have a set of religious animistic art that will spread throughout Western Europe by sea. So we have this older sense that deer, stags more properly, are related to rebirth and the continuation of the species, to survive, linked to light illumination. In the Bronze Age, deer will be increasingly associated with this idea of rebirth and increasingly associated with the sun, becoming solar animals. In other words, deer represent life, movement, after-death dynamism. And as Professor Johnni Langer mentioned in his video, this representation between swastikas and life was very common in ancient Greek art, often associated with gods, the divine feminine, especially goddesses like Demeter and Artemis, who are associated with cycles of life, death, rebirth. I would like to, once again, elaborate a little more on this, just for a better understanding. We have, for example, Greek ceramics in which there is a clear representation of swastikas in a context of catastrophe and death. For example, sailors drowning and swastikas appear in their places on the boat, on their seats, and the dead are subject to a transformation and are replaced by swastikas, a context of death and rebirth. But we have, of course, for example, beautiful, fantastic ceramics associated with goddesses. The association of the swastika with deities is certainly seen during the geometric and orientalizing periods of the Hellenic cultural world. In the geometric period, we find that the swastika can be found especially with images of Artemis and Demeter. For instance, given that Artemis was the goddess of the hunt, wild animals, wilderness, childbirth, and virginity, we can have a pretty good idea of the connotations here implied. She was also seen as a guardian of young girls and the bringer and alleviator of disease in women. Certainly all these attributes qualify as aspects of life. We do get the perception from these ceramics that the swastika is a symbolic representation of life, but it also gives us proof of being used in association with deities as an astronomical symbol as well: the sun, the light, the heavens, the divine, the afterlife. Swastikas in context associated with Demeter, also symbolizing some form of life-giving quality, a symbol of Demeter's association with grains and the fertility of the earth, and her powers of regenerating land. So here we see a broader panorama of iconography and symbolism, and these ideas report us back to the Hedeby funerary ceramic that contains deer and swastikas, this idea of life and rebirth. Focusing now on the geographical context of this artifact and the historical period, we have come to see that many pre-Christian burials in Northern Europe present iconography related to deer, being important elements in funerary contexts, representing this survival of life in the afterlife, not only referring to prehistoric animist rock art, as spoken before, and the meaning of the continuation of life through the fertility of the sexual act, but also the death, the destruction of the antlers of these animals that have a cyclical existence, the changing of the antlers, renewing their antlers every year, renewing their crowns, their weapons, renewing all these symbolisms linked to a very prominent and visually appealing element in the construction of symbolisms and concepts linked to the cycle of life and the importance of regeneration and rebirth. Cyclical repetition of life that will be related to the idea of life after death, in which there is no death at all, but in fact the survival of the being on other modes of life. This all ties up into the idea of rebirth, right? Taking into account the historical economic context of the time and the place itself, Hedeby, these animals were also extremely important in the local economy and throughout Scandinavia. These animals had commercial importance. Their skins, their antlers, many of which were turned into combs for the elite, a costly product. The first great city of the Viking Age in Scandinavia, Ribe, the first Danish town to be named in written sources, was an important center of trade where several people gathered to trade and exchange products, and such animals, deer, were really of great importance on a commercial level as well. Therefore, this pottery from Hedeby has a symbolism of rebirth, of life after death. Therefore, this solar cross on top, very similar to what would become the Renaissance proto-Ægishjálmur of Iceland, here in the context of Hedeby of the Viking Age, would therefore have a meaning of rebirth, of life, which is a totally different meaning from what later the symbols, both the proto-Ægishjálmur and the Ægishjálmur itself, will have in later times. If indeed these symbols are the visual origin of what would later be the Ægishjálmur, there is clearly a loss of meaning. There is a loss and forgetfulness of the knowledge and meaning of these symbols within the pre-Christian pagan context. What we can conclude from all of this is that if this is really the symbol that will visually influence in part the visual construction of the Ægishjálmur, perhaps the influence was more of a geographical cultural point of medieval Ireland, because in a Scandinavian context there is a large gap between the Hedeby symbol and the first proto-Ægishjálmur. We are talking about a period of about more or less 800 years in which there is simply no evidence at all of a continuation of this symbol in Scandinavia and Iceland, but instead in a Judeo-Christian context from Ireland. Therefore, medieval Irish context symbolism is more likely to be related to Galdrastafir Icelandic context within the design of Ægishjálmur type of symbols. Of course, we cannot forget, obviously, that in the 14th century there are actually a number of symbols in a Greek context, sigils which undoubtedly influenced the magical arts through symbols from all over Europe, modern Europe, and these grimoires are especially influential in the formation of magical symbols in French, English and Icelandic contexts. There is no doubt that these are symbols that have a more direct influence on Icelandic magic staves in Iceland from the 1500s all the way to the 19th century. Symbols that have had an influence on the creation of certain symbols or certain magical sigils. But then again, taking into account the similar symbols found in Eastern Europe, there seems to have been a cultural and visual syncretism in the formation of these symbols in the Byzantine area, mixing ancient pagan symbols with Judeo-Christian symbols and iconography. And I would like to point out that even though there's a clear visual influence that the Greek Judeo-Christian sigils have had on the Icelandic magic staves, these late medieval Greek symbols may have also been influenced by early pre-Christian, even pre-Jewish symbols. I'm not talking about the pre-Christian Eastern European pagan symbols we have seen here, but instead far older symbols of pre-Jewish origins. Let us not forget one of the most important symbols of the goddess Istar, the eight-pointed star or eight branches symbol. More than 3,000 years earlier than the time of Christ, we have the eight-pointed star of the Sumerian goddess Inanna and her East Semitic counterpart Istar. And these star signs with 8 points were established in the Euphrates-Tigris region over 5,000 years ago, which will later be associated with Venus and such and so on and so forth. This symbol in part may also be the visual origins of the Judeo-Christian symbols of Byzantine context, which in turn were also influenced by Eastern European pagan, solar and rebirth symbols. So there's a great mixture here of cultures, meanings, the visual representations of important religious iconography and symbols. But well, there is still the problem of the large time gap in relation to these symbols in Scandinavia between the 8th century and the 16th century in Iceland, where the first proto-Ægishjálmur appears. There is no symbology similar to this within this period in the Scandinavian context that could indicate a more direct influence. So it is not worth speculating and conjecturing, because there really are no more elements that we can concretely study and create a line of cultural and visual influences. For now, this is where we stay until more evidence emerges, of course. For now, what we can really objectively conclude, in addition to what has already been said here, is that there is also the hypothesis that the Ægishjálmur may also have started from a modification of a runic symbol of the runic calendar that was developed from the 13th century, duplicated and thus creating the proto-Ægishjálmur of the 1500s. This is a hypothesis, but there is still no concrete proof because, of course, the runic calendar will not have this complete form. This symbol in itself may have had other influences. This is an ideogram quite common on rock carvings from the Neolithic period. It is also the sign of the fish spear, the staff of the Greek Poseidon and the Roman Neptune, and Jupiter's staff is this staff doubled, which is the one we see right here or somewhere on the screen. If we turn it 90 degrees, we are left with the graph for the zodiacal sign of Pisces, which isn't surprising that both Jupiter, according to older traditions, and Neptune, according to modern astrology, are the ruling planets of Pisces. But as I was saying, this is also the sign for the golden number 18 used in the Scandinavian clog almanacs. The golden number indicated the cycle of the moon in relation to the number of days in a solar year and made it possible to calculate the days of the full and new moons as well as the dates of eclipses. The golden numbers on the clog almanacs are what is left of the old Nordic lunar calendar based on the phases of the moon. With the arrival of Christianity, of course, the calendar was changed and restructured according to the solar year. But this sign was also one of the letters, for instance, of the alphabet used around the year 1000 in Romania, which may indicate again an Eastern influence appearing in Scandinavia as a result of the Scandinavians' commercial relations and the journeys with the East, precisely in the Middle Ages, in the so-called Viking Age, the late Scandinavian Iron Age. And its meaning may very well have changed to mean something else entirely in the Middle Ages, since it is also quite similar to the sign of Jesus Christ. The combination of the diagonal cross with a vertical line, which is of special importance in Western ideography. The sign of Christ from the initials of the Lord's name in Greek, I and X, which is also a symbol from the Ice Age, by the way. And I remind you that this is also an important Berber symbol of the free man. I wasn't able to dig much deeper into this one, unfortunately, because, well, sadly, when it comes to Berber history, there aren't many studies. I do have a couple of books, and by a couple of books, I literally mean only two, but there isn't anything substantial to add to this symbol. Berber signs and symbols are ancient. The great majority of them can already be found in prehistoric rock art, but that is quite common on several parts of the Northern Hemisphere. If we take into consideration that the great majority of Berber signs are pre-Islamic, Berber signs are at the very least before the 7th century of the Common Era, but are certainly far, far older. As we can see, there's a lot of similar symbols in several cultures. The visual origins are many and symbols travel more than people. Only the conceptions, the meanings change according to each culture and religious perceptions in each time period. However, the most substantial, most concrete and most accepted hypothesis at this moment is that the Icelandic Ægishjálmur came from the medieval grimoires that were popularized in Greece in the 15th century and spread throughout Europe, including England and France, that present grimoires with very identical symbols and sigils, And of course, it all eventually reaching Iceland in the 16th century, the early 1500s. Well, these are the only symbols that already contain a much more concrete and decisive form or morphology that is much more connected to the Ægishjálmur Solomonic symbols that, as you can see here in this video, and as I've mentioned earlier on in other videos, they were much more similar to the Ægishjálmur, and this is the most direct visual evidence. Perhaps these grimoires are the most direct answer to the visual origins of the Ægishjálmur and other Icelandic magic staves. The solar cross that we saw earlier may have ended up being lost, completely lost in Scandinavia and not having a continuity, and instead it is the symbols and sigils of Eastern origins, Eastern European, Eastern Mediterranean and Middle Eastern origin that will really be in the visual origins more directly with the Ægishjálmur. Therefore, I repeat once again, what we really have concrete so far is that the Icelandic magical symbols were directly influenced by the medieval grimoires of the East. Connections with pre-Christian Scandinavia and Christian Ireland still need further study and more evidence. However, they show us a more complete picture of the diffusion of similar symbols, right? Well, I do hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, obviously, a very special thanks to Professor Johnni Langer for his wonderful work and for allowing me to take part in this and contribute with more evidences. My dear friends, thank you very much. If you can, consider becoming my patron. Your help is surely appreciated to continue on with the research and bring you this type of content. Thank you. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.